Tying into that point, after your victory, let's speak that into existence.
Absolutely.
What initiatives will be put in place to help close that racial wealth gap? And because Atlanta is such a mecca for African American and African American entrepreneurs, and the state of Georgia is amazing, what plans can entrepreneurs look forward to that you'll put in place that will help
So
us close that gap?
absolutely. So the commercial investment program is a big one because the state spends billions of dollars on a range of things. So it's not just construction contracts for DOT, it's who's providing food at events that the state is doing. It's who's doing janitorial services, who is providing the paper. All of those purchases are purchases that the state can direct. And so the Georgia Commercial Investment Program is part of it. But the other part is the Supplier Diversity Initiative. And that is, I'm going to make certain that state agencies, all of them, when they procure goods and services, that they have to actively seek out and support new suppliers that are owned by groups that are underrepresented. And that includes people of color, veterans, the disabled, women, but all of those groups have to be given primacy. And because in Georgia, those groups often overlap, by targeting these communities, we actually hit the broadest swath of possibilities. I also want to make certain that major state contractors have to implement their own programs for supplier diversity. Why should the state contract with someone who is not looking at the whole state as viable? And then the last big thing for me is what I call cluster contracts. So you have these big companies that bid on these major contracts, billion-dollar contracts. If you're a small company, if you can't bite off $1 billion, but you could do about 200 million. Right now, you're not permitted to participate. Instead, they give it to the big company and they tell the big company, oh, give them 10%. The 10% rarely materializes, or it always goes to the same small company they've always given it to. I want to create what I call cluster contracts, letting 2 or 3 or 4 businesses come together to bid on that contract. So you have 4 companies that instead of all trying to compete for this $1 billion contract, they instead get 150 million, 250, 350 of that contract, but they can all grow at the same time and they're hiring new people. And when you combine that with the small business investment fund that can underwrite the capital risk and you're directing technical assistance to make sure they can actually participate in the process. Because if you've ever tried to bid on a state contract or even a city contract, procurement's hard.
Yeah.
I was the lawyer for one of the lawyers for procurement at the city of Atlanta. And so for me, it's not just about what I know as an entrepreneur, it's also what I know as someone who's been on the delivery side of government, not just running for office, but actually having to do the work of making it happen. And so those are 3 big opportunities. I'm talking billions of dollars that can suddenly be in the hands and in the pockets of people of color, of Black people in particular, because we're 33% of the population. We're 2.1% of the business revenue in Georgia.
So let me ask you this: for education, I saw you was talking to a little baby the other day, and you was kind of educating him on why governor is so important. Can you just explain? So there's no Black governors, right?
Correct.
All right. So there's no Black governors currently in America. And from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the reason why that's such a big issue and the reason why the governor is so important is that the governor is really the most powerful person in the state because they control budgets, they control a lot of the state issues, even more so than state representatives or senators. And the president doesn't really have power on a state level. This is why, like COVID, is so many different rules depending on which state you're in. So, can you give us an education on why the governor is so important and why people need to pay more attention to who their governor is?
Absolutely. So let's think about it this way. When we think about the structure of government, we have been trained to focus on the president because that's the most powerful job in the nation. And for Black and brown people, it's also been incredibly important because states have often refused to acknowledge our citizenship and our humanity. So I'll use 3 examples. Stand Your Ground, the law that killed Trayvon Martin, that wasn't federal law. That was signed by the governor of Florida. That's how Stand Your Ground became. But once it happens in a state, it spreads like a contagion. So now you've got Stand Your Ground in Georgia and everywhere else. Number 2, mass incarceration did not start with the 94 crime bill. 3 strikes you're out was actually done by the governor of California in 1994. The federal government decided to follow, but it started with the governor. And Jim Crow, the stripping Black people of humanity for 150 years, never had a single federal law. It was all state laws signed by governors. And so when we think about how our lives are lived, we think about the presidency because it's national or the mayor because it's hyper local. But all the money that comes from the federal government comes through the state. The governor decides. All of the things your mayor wants to do In the South, and especially in Georgia, has to be approved by, if it's a big program, it has to be approved by the governor. One example is that in 2003, I worked for Shirley Franklin. I wrote the first living wage law in the history of the state of Georgia. It would have guaranteed that any company doing business in Georgia had to pay a living wage. It could have transformed the economies of thousands of Georgians. We got that legislation through the city council, the mayor signed it, and the following January, the governor signed a law making it illegal for any city to pass a law guaranteeing a wage. That's what the state does. If you're worried about housing, the governor has to sign legislation that says that that local government has the authority to actually enforce housing rules and make sure that you can afford to live in the home that you live in. But for business owners, where the governor is so incredibly important, is that most of the decisions we think have to be made by committee, in Georgia, it gets made by the governor. Right now, the governor of Georgia is spending billions of dollars. Every time you hear him announce money that's being, out of that COVID money that's being spent, he doesn't have to ask a single person for permission. He decides by himself, with whomever he decides to bring in the room, how he wants to spend that money. So the question is, whose name do you want to have on the checkbook? Someone who does not believe in investing in communities of color, someone who has never demonstrated any interest until it was election year, or someone who has come up the hard way through our business community and through our city and state, who has the knowledge and experience, but also now the authority to get good done. And the shorthand is, imagine Maynard Jackson and what he did for Atlanta. Imagine if he had been governor of Georgia. That's the kind of governor I could be.
Wow.
Yeah. So in order to have the right governor, you have to mobilize people to vote. And one of the things that you did in general election, and rightfully so, you were credited with helping win Georgia and ultimately winning the general election for Biden, was getting people out. But when you get people out in numbers, certain things start to change, and you start to see more voter suppression, and you see more voter discrimination. So my question to you is, like, what do we do now, right? It feels like we have to press the reset to make sure that people understand the influence and impact that this is going to have. And so is there education around it? How are we telling the people, the population of Georgia, like, hey, there are some changes. Here's what you need to know before you go out?
Well, most of my entrepreneurship has focused on business-oriented things because I grew up poor. I didn't like it and don't ever want to do it again. And I like being able to take care of myself and take care of my family. But I've also been very aggressive about nonprofit work and civic work. So I created the New Georgia Project. I'm no longer affiliated with it, but I launched the New Georgia Project in 2013. That's the organization that did a lot of the work on getting people registered. I created Fair Fight, which is the work that we've been doing to make sure that we have fair voting laws, or if the laws are not fair, that we know why they're not fair and we fight back. I created the organization Fair Count. Fair Count made certain that we had an accurate census for the first time in 30 years, actually counting Black and brown folks. And it was the first year in almost 30 years we did not have a statistical undercount. And that matters to businesses because the money that comes to the state through the SBA and through all of these different grants and loans, it's all based on the accurate count of the people in your state. So when Black people get undercounted, we also get under-resourced. So those are the groups I've started. And part of what all of those groups are doing, independent of me, independent of my campaign, but they are embedded in community, making sure people understand what the voting laws are, what changed, what stayed the same, and why it matters. Separately, our campaign is doing that same work through our voter protection efforts. That's why we're urging people to vote early. We get 3 weeks of voting in Georgia starting October 17th because of how difficult these new laws are, because of the hurdles that Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger have put in place. Do not get distracted by the fact that they didn't commit treason. The same time they were not committing treason, they were also putting in more voter suppression laws. And because of those new voter suppression laws, we need folks to vote early to get it out of the way. In Georgia, we have the #1 likelihood of having long lines in Black communities, up to 8 hours. And so if we want people to be able to vote, we need to get our votes banked. We need to get it done and get on with our lives. And that means voting as much as possible, as early as possible. And when I say as much as possible, I mean getting as many people as possible. Nobody should vote more than once. I don't want anyone to take me out of context. So